Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Deadhead Cannabis Show. I'm one of your co-hosts, Larry Mishkin of the Hoban Law Group, based out of Chicago, Illinois, sunny and cold, and about to get a lot colder here, unfortunately. With me today are my two co-hosts, Jim Marty, who you all know and love from the beginning of time. He and I have been doing this thing. Jim with the Bridge West Group, a top-flight cannabis accountant, and also with us, our newest co-host, Rob Hunt of sunny California, and all things good in the investment world. Gentlemen, always a pleasure to have you on board. Rob, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Larry. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. You know, this is a lot of fun. I know we have some fun stuff set up to talk about today. And, you know, what our listeners don't know is all the fun that you and I have and, you know, Jim have talking all week about what we're going to talk about on the show, exchanging shows and set lists. And, you know, it's really kind of taken over a regular part of my week in a fun way. And Jim Marty, how are you doing, sir?
Very good. I'm here in windy Colorado. We've had some major dumps of snow up in the mountains, including now we have several places that have avalanche warnings. In fact, I'm sorry to report that there's 3 missing backcountry skiers right now. They've been missing for about 3 days, so their prospects do not look good.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but it sounds like you're once again on the road. You're always somewhere. Where are you this time?
I'm on my way home. I was seeing clients today in Boulder and Denver. The cannabis world is rocking and rolling. Went to a cultivation that's under construction, went to a greenhouse farm that just got acquired by a publicly traded company. General Cannabis is the name of the publicly traded company. I can say that because they're publicly traded.
Very nice. Well, that's always good to know. The exciting news out of Chicago is it looks like we may have some sort of resolution with the dispensary licenses. The people with the perfect scores are going to be all put into one general lottery. And then everybody else who got an 85% or better score will be put into a second lottery of an additional 75 licenses. So the good news is they'll be coming on board with 150 new licenses. You know, that'll be good for the public. May take a while for the market to catch up with all of it. But we're excited about that. If it really happens, we'll see. This is Illinois. We've been promised before. So until those licenses are issued, who knows? We'll keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best. Moving on to things that are fun to talk about and always work well, no matter when you're talking about them. Today is February 3rd. Of course, it's calendar year 2021. But just about 50 years ago, 40 years ago.
42.
42 years ago. Okay, well, there you go. That's why I'm a lawyer and not a mathematician. February 3rd, 1979, the Grateful Dead at a pivotal moment in their career, getting ready to literally close the door on the Keith Gauchow era at keyboard and raise the curtain on the Brent Midland era, not quite, but very shortly after this show, within a month or two, I believe. And yet here they are with this lineup that is not long for the making, and they throw down what I think most people would have to be considered one of the hotter shows of the 1979 year. Certainly a treat for a town like Indianapolis, which always seemed to get more than its fair share of hot shows, whether they were at Deer Creek or there. One year, guys, I even saw them in 1984 outdoors at the that's where they used to have the National Amateur Tennis Championships every year on clay courts. And they had the concert there, and they put down tarps over the clay courts. But everything else was like being there to watch tennis. So they served these wild drinks with, you know, straws and umbrellas and everything like that. But we always saw great shows in Indianapolis, and it was always a lot of fun. But this one's a really, really good one. And I thank Rob for being astute enough to recognize what day of the year it was on the calendar and pulling this one out. Rob, when you see the date, what makes you think of this show?
Well, first of all, I mean, a lot of our listeners don't realize that we record the show a couple of days before we publish it. So, you know, you might be listening to this after February 3rd, but, you know, I knew that our recording date was the 3rd of February. And I can tell you that, you know, there's a handful of shows that, you know, back before we had archive.org and back before, you know, there's this massive ability digitally to trade. Oftentimes, you know, the Deadheads were relegated to tape trading, which meant you were looking for the best quality soundboards you could find. And if you got some really hot recordings, you know, you held on to those and probably played those tapes to death. And so in high school, for me, one of the first just like immaculate soundboards that I had was 2379 from Springfield. And my best friend in high school was just addicted to the show. So I think we went probably 6 months where he only had that one tape in his tape deck, to the point that we thought it was like fused inside there. And we probably heard that Scarlet Fire 1,000 times, over senior year. And not to mention, the first set of that show, just being a scorcher as well. The thing that sticks out to me about that show is it's the only time I can think of in Grateful Dead history where they played a Scarlet Fire, a China Rider, and an Estimated Eyes all in the same show, which, kind of is like the three classic combinations, like besides Help Slip Franklin's that Deadheads think about as, typifying the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So for me, it was just one that anytime I hear February 3rd, my mind automatically goes to Market Square Arena.
I would agree with that. And, it's not just that they drop a China Rider, Scarlet Fire, Estimated Eyes. The Scarlet Fire Estimated Eyes is, it played, started the second set. It's killer all the way through. And this was right when this format was just beginning, the Scarlet Fire Estimated Eyes. And they play it like, it's as fresh and new to them as it is. And it's really wonderful. And it's not just that they threw the China Rider in, because, as I've discovered looking back prior to in fact, the first show I saw in 1982, they closed the first set with China Rider. And that was not uncommon for a long time in the 1970s for them to close the first set with China Rider. But here they dropped the China Rider into the middle of the first set. And I've never seen that. I've never seen them drop a China Rider into the middle of either set. It either ended the first set. Every now and then, I guess they'd open a show with it, but otherwise, right, it would be a pretty much a standard second set opener. And the fact that they chose to play it in the first set, but in the middle of the first set, to me, that's the part that I love. You're just listening, and it's a fairly standard, Promised Land, Candyman, Mama Tried, Mexicali Blues, China Rider. And then just as easily, boom, back to Minglewood Blues, Staggerly, to give a little Donna moment in there, and then, music never stopped. But that's a real, that's one of those things that just makes you stop all of a sudden on a dime and say, what's happening here? And that's very cool. I love that.
And you always think of Promised Land as being a first set closer. You don't really think of it as a first set opener. So to have Promised Land kicking it out of the gate, and what really makes this version really interesting is that the recordings that most people had, the sound was really, really low for the Promised Land and for the first maybe like 30 seconds of the Candyman. And then all of a sudden the sound engineers get it together. And if you listen to the recording, it's so quiet in the arena that you can hear people speaking, and you can actually hear, someone in the audience just yell to the band, like, louder. And right as they yell louder, all of a sudden the sound peaks in. So it's like, in the Candyman's in town, and it just triples, and the crowd just goes nuts, because it's one of those moments where it's like the band heard the sound engineer heard the person in the crowd yelling for it to get louder, and just like triples in volume. So whenever I think of that recording, or I think of that night, I always think about the Candyman.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I had listened to the show before, and it was just not anything I had focused on. But the minute you mentioned it to me, I went back and boom, sure enough, there it was. Jim, Marty, let me ask you, because this show itself, you may have some comments on, but if I remember correctly, this is very close in time, geographically or temporally, or whatever we say in the business, to when you saw your first Grateful Dead show. Is that not true?
Yes, it was the same tour, just a couple of weeks earlier in Springfield, Massachusetts. My girlfriend at the time got the tickets for Christmas of 1978. Me and her brother Brian went down to the show. I don't know how she did it, but she got fifth row center. I was making eye contact with Jerry Garcia, and
that's awesome.
Great show. And I remember how surprised Maureen's brother was that the guy next to us had been to 25 shows. He goes, wow, who goes to 25 concerts? We hadn't heard of the multiple concert thing at the time, but it was a wonderful show, and it ties into what we're talking about. And oh, by the way, that girlfriend has been my wife for 40 years now.
Okay, good. Nice to know.
We're tying this in. It was one of the last Keith and Donna shows, and then February 3rd, they must not have had too many more Keith and Donna shows after February 3rd.
Right. As I recall, I'm looking at it now. I believe the Brent Midland's first show with the band was sometime in April of '79 in San Jose.
April 22nd.
Yep, San Jose, and I've heard a tape of that show too. And if I'm not mistaken, they opened that show with "Passenger," which was such a great song for them to come right out of the box with. He's got the Hammond organ just wailing. It's like, "Here I am," and boom. That's a great show too. For this time, and it's really an interesting time for the Grateful Dead, right? Because I mean, they're closing out the '70s, and the '70s were such a highly productive era for them. And I think that for a lot of Deadheads, 73 and 77 are probably the two holy grail years of Grateful Dead music. If you don't want to count the psychedelic years of 67 through 69 or whatever, but certainly in the '70s, that ruled. And that's, when the band really took off and made a name for itself. And here it was at the end of the '70s, kind of trying to remain relevant in the disco era. And, so much changing everywhere. Keith Gauchow is leaving the band. They're bringing in this new guy. And, who knew that as they, kind of exploded into the '80s, that Brent and Jerry, would connect, the way that they did. And I think Phil was really tuned into that. And, it just took them to a whole nother level throughout the 1980s, as long as Jerry was healthy. But this was it. This was that moment. You don't get a lot of those transition periods. With Fish, they just stop playing for 3 years and then come back as version 2.0 or 3.0. And other than the Dead's one vacation year, not really vacation, but year off or whatever in '75, they had always just kept playing. But this was definitely a point in time when you could see that difference. And it's kind of exciting because they weathered it very well and just kept rolling right along.
Yes, my second Grateful Dead show was May 12th, 1979, with Brett Midland, one of his first shows at the UMass, University of Massachusetts, where we were attending college. They did a spring tour of college football stadiums, and that was a wonderful show. And that's when I really got hooked. Great Jack Straw. And what I really remember, UMass is in an agricultural area with lots of cows, and the drum solo was so loud and rolling, and I'm looking out at the fields of cows, wondering, I wonder what these cows think of this drum solo.
Well, so that's really kind of cool. Think about that. Your first two shows, you saw Keith and then you saw Brent. I mean, you can't really do much better than that. That's very cool.
Yep. And the first show was great. The second show was when I really got it.
So I'll go back and say sometimes, your first show, you don't realize, how special something you saw was because you have nothing to compare it to. You've got no basis of a foundation. And I look at 115.79 and I think that, for me, I wore that tape out to death also, Jim, principally because the transition jam between the I Need a Miracle into the Shakedown Street is legendary. I mean, we could do an entire show just on that 4-minute segue of Miracle into Shakedown. If you were to ask a lot of people I know, name the single greatest thing the Grateful Dead ever did, as a transition, I think most of them would point to that moment. So at the time, you probably thought they did that every night, but just did it the build up and crescendo where it's like did it into the shakedown. It's just like nothing they've ever done before. And just Jerry walked up the scales and scales and scales until he just, drops it along with a fill bomb into the shakedown. So, I mean, your first show, good for you. That was your first one.
Yes. And like you just said, I agree with what you just said. I really wasn't comprehending how special that show was. I mean, we all enjoyed it. But yeah, when it's your first Grateful Dead show, you don't know quite what to expect. You don't know quite how to handle all the things going on around you and on the stage and the band and the drums and the space. Yeah, it really is, like you said, that second show, then you have something to compare it to.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, I got the other transition, which is, my first 14 or 15 shows were with Brent. And then the rest of my, time seeing the Dead was with Vince. But what I will say is during that transition period, I got the greatest period of Bruce Hornsby, which is, the first year of Bruce Hornsby playing with the Dead while Vince was trying to figure it out.
Any show where they played Down the Old Valley Road was a good show for me. I just love that. They just
walk on.
Yep, they just cranked that, and they did great with that. No, and that's funny for me too because from the overwhelming majority of my shows were in the Brent era, and I mean Vince. Although I saw a decent number of shows in the '90s, I always kind of thought of them as a Brent band, and Vince was the new guy, and although look, I give Vince a lot of credit. He stepped into a really tough situation. He handled it really well, and he added his own. That Baba O'Reilly "Tomorrow Never Knows" encore was one of the best encore combinations they ever played, and that was him. He drove that, and that was great.
Yeah, I think we're probably going to spend some time discussing Vince and the influence that he had with song selection and all the what a huge Beatles fan he was and how many songs he brought. And I think we've got an episode coming up here in a couple of weeks where we're going to talk about that a bit more. But Vince was certainly outside of just the music that he brought to the band, was the influence of other music that he brought that they started playing, especially a lot of cover songs.
Big Steve tells a good Vince Welnick story. I guess one of the first times Vince Welnick played with the Grateful Dead and became a member of the band, after the show or when they got back to the hotel or whenever, Big Steve handed Vince his show check, his check for playing the show. And he looked at it, he goes, "Is this for the whole tour?" He had no idea that he would make that much money in a single night.
And I think what a lot of people don't know is that the Grateful Dead were very even-handed about how people got paid. You'd think that when you have a new musician come into the band who hasn't been with the band for the past 30 years, that they probably would have paid him significantly less, and that wasn't the democracy. It was the Grateful Dead. They paid roadies exceptionally well. They paid band members. They treated everyone as if they were a band member if you were actually part of that core group, which was really unique to that organization.
Yes, another quick Big Steve. He said Jerry would say to him, especially on the Jerry Garcia band tours, he'd ask Big Steve, "Hey, did everybody get paid okay?"
Well, that's, and Rob, your point exactly, and that story, Jim, too. You can go get MBAs in business management studying Grateful Dead business management theory now, both in terms of how they ran their own organization internally, as well as how they marketed themselves by, letting people come in and tape their shows, and the innovations that they brought to the business world that proved to be successful, that were so against the grain. We could easily spend a show just talking about that, and maybe we will, because it's people want to think of them as a bunch of tripping, hippies who got up on stage and played music, but these were pretty bright guys.
Yeah. And Jim, I'm really glad you brought up Big Steve's show, because I don't know if everyone out there realizes, but this week, Gary Lambert and David Gans were kind enough to have me on Tales from the Golden Road, and actually allowed me to plug the Deadhead Cannabis Hour to their entire audience, and actually put the logo for the Deadhead Cannabis Hour up on their Facebook page. So hopefully that brings a new audience to us. So, very, very gracious. And David and Gary, if you're listening, from all of us, sincerely thank you. And it was very gracious to have me on and to let me discuss what we're doing over here.
I mean, look, let's not kid ourselves. I mean, those guys are kind of probably, the center of the Deadhead universe in terms of keepers of the knowledge and the culture. I mean, people tune into that show just to hear the stories that they have to tell, and the people who come on and share stories with them based on the connections that they've made. And, I mean, it is the fact that they would, let you plug the show and put it up there. But I think that speaks to what you were just saying a second ago, Rob, which is the whole mentality that from their perspective, I don't think they look at it as competition. I think they look at it as, just more extension of the Grateful Dead family, and people out there, spreading the good word about the Grateful Dead and all the good things that they did. And for God's sakes, tying it into something as wonderful as cannabis, you can't go wrong with that.
Oh, they teased me for it. They said, "Yeah, that's it's peanut butter and jelly, basically. It's the natural combination." Like, "Oh, Deadhead Cannabis Show, huh? Who came up with that, brilliant idea?" So, and on top of that, David Lemieux actually is really gracious on Twitter with me also when I mentioned that I was doing this, and David Lemieux, did a couple tweets out about it as well. So, I mean, again, that just shows the generosity of, the inner core of the Grateful Dead community, of how supportive they are of other people that are still trying to keep the flame alive and trying to make sure that, the music and the vibe is passed on to as many people out there as possible. And, again, a big thank you to everyone that's part of that organization for how gracious they've always been every time I've interacted.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful to hear. And of course, for our listeners who may or may not know, David Lemieux is the new Dick, in the sense that after Dick Litvala passed away, David Lemieux stepped in to become the keeper of the Holy Grail, or the vault, as we like to say. And he's the one that plays a primary role through his Dave's Pick series of determining which shows are released from the vault. And although he's tended to show a very, very heavy prevalence for the 1970s, he has expanded out a bit into the 1980s now, which is very exciting to see. And generally speaking, I have to say that he picks some pretty good shows for us to listen to.
Definitely. So I'm still waiting for him to release a few more of those early '79 shows we've been talking about, because I do think that the end of that era, I know Larry, you consistently talk about the closing of the Winterland, which is only a month before Jim's first show, but that era from like January until the Brent era started, I think personally are some of the hottest shows that the Grateful Dead ever played. I love that Spring '79. I think Spring '79 just has such an amazing sound. There's so many very unique characteristics where there's riffs that Garcia only played during that period that I never heard again afterwards.
Attention Cannabis Podcast listeners. You can now listen to your favorite cannabis podcast ad-free with the MJ Bulls mobile app. Just download the free MJ Bulls mobile app to your smartphone to start enjoying cannabis podcasts with no commercials. Go to Apple Apps or Google Play to get the MJ Bulls Cannabis Podcast app today.
Well, I kind of like to think, and maybe this is just me being a wishful deadhead, but that closing of the Winterland show is like the kind of show, that really could have propelled them forward. I mean, that was such for the time, to come out and play a 4-hour show like that and to play that screamed of early 1970s. But they brought the energy and they brought, all of it. And of course it was a special night, and, they were closing a venerable old place that had been their home for years and years. But I think they really fed off of the energy of that show. At least that's what I'd like to think. And you're right. I mean, they kind of exploded into the 1979. And then another part of it was the way that Brent really kind of seamlessly transitioned into the band. There really wasn't a hiccup there. I mean, he was just that talented of a musician that, it took him a while to find his exact footing, but he had no problem filling in the spaces in between. And, I love listening to his B3 all of a sudden on the scene. It's just, it's so much energy, and it's just such a, a good omen of things to come that, now we got this guy who plays like Greg Allman, for God's sakes, and sings like him too. It was very cool.
Oh, I love those big keyboard riffs of his that really he would just take off and fly.
Well, I have to tell you, on those nights when, our eyes were, maybe spinning counterclockwise, you would always look down on the stage by the B3, right, for the big cooler thing that the harder he played, the faster it would spin around. And we'd all look at that thing and we'd say, oh man, that's spinning around fast. Brent's cranking now. And
well, that's the way Melvin Seals was during like a Mississippi Moon or or Lucky Old Sun. During those organ jams, you'd look on top of Melvin's stack and you just see that thing humming. And as you said, the faster it went, the deeper that was.
Yep, that was great stuff. I really, really love that, and so much that that Brent brought to it, and we can spend, and we will, I'm sure, spend time talking about that. Some of his mid 1980s stuff is just, I liken it to that scene in the original Matrix towards the end where Neo gets shot, and then he gets up, and all of a sudden he can see that everything in the he can see that he's the one, and he sees it all in the code. Mid 1983, I think, for Brent, it just kind of clicked in his head, and from that point forward, not that everything prior to that point wasn't good, but he really came into his own and became a force to be reckoned with within the band. Was no longer the new guy, and this is an exciting time for the Grateful Dead.
Yeah. So one of the other things that I think we should touch on is just kind of the role that technology played in the Grateful Dead community. And I think people forget that a lot of the things that happened, as far as multi-track recording devices and the wall of sound and other things that that are standard now in recording of music and standard for live music and the way that people fly their PA these days. A lot of that's directly attributed to the work that the Grateful Dead did in their early sound engineers and the people that are associated with it. And I also think that, the tech community in general has been really attracted to the Grateful Dead specifically because there's always been that nexus between technology and sound. And, I think that we definitely saw that with John Perry Barlow, and we definitely saw that with, different sound engineers that they had, sitting in, whether it was Healy or whether it was Betty Cantor. That there was just, some terrific people that knew how to use technology to their advantage. I mean, all the way back to Owsley Stanley being a part of, putting the sound together. And I think I think we're seeing that today in kind of the way technology in cannabis has a very similar nexus and watching what's happening in our space. And, one of the things that Larry and I have been playing around with here for the last period of time is a new technology that's bringing everyone in both the Grateful Dead community and in the cannabis community together, which is a platform that's called Clubhouse. And Larry, I know you've had a chance to mess around with it a little bit.
It's really funny because, I hate to admit it, but, I'm old. And when it comes to, all of this kind of stuff, a lot of it happens and I just don't even know that it's out there. But yeah, since you turned me on to it the other day, Rob, and Jim, you're next. So I figure if I can learn how to do it, you can too. It's very cool to all of a sudden, within a matter of seconds, Rob and I are talking on the phone. We hang up. The next thing I know, we're communicating in a room. And, somebody pops into the room to see what's going on because they like the title of the room. And the next thing you know, we're talking to this person. And, Rob, you can tell us in a minute about how you did it the other night. You had, ultimately as many as 1,000 different people who came through to listen to what you have to say. And I think it's great. And I think it sends a wonderful message. And it's a great way to communicate. But what really cracked me up was after you and I stopped talking, within 5 minutes later, all of a sudden, it popped up on there that a notice that my oldest son, is on Clubhouse, and so it gave me that notice. And 2 minutes later, I got a text from him. "What are you doing on Clubhouse?" I wrote back and I said, "I'm kind of hip and cool." But then, conversely, last night, I tried to brag about it to my 19-year-old, and he wasn't even quite sure what Clubhouse was. And he's like, "Oh yeah, that's like all these other ones that they've had where you can go in and chat. That's just the next generation. These people are just trying to be hip and cool." I'm like, "Dude, if you don't know about it, that's okay. I beat you to it. That you can fess up to that." But no, I think it's great. And look, people in technology were the deadheads and are the deadheads, and it's no surprise that the same technology. I mean, the Dead. Think about this. By the time Jerry Garcia died, none of this had happened. The internet was brand new. There was no cell phones of the kind we have now. There was none of this communication, right? If you wanted to find out what the Dead played, you had to call 1-800-USA-DEAD and listen to the guy read through the list and pay 75 cents a minute on the phone and hope, you didn't miss it while he was reading the list. Because if you did, you had to call in again. We're the fact that technology is evolving the way it does and that the people in business, especially in the cannabis industry, are picking it up and running with it is no surprise. To me, it's just, a matter of finding it. And, thankfully, you're young enough and hip and cool enough to know where this stuff is. And, but I think it's great. I think it's going to be a great way to both promote cannabis and for all sorts of people, musical groups, anybody with ideas to be able to promote their ideas.
Yeah. So I was saying the first time I ever got on the internet was after the Grateful Dead played in Salt Lake City in the beginning of 1995, and they broke out Visions of Johanna for the first time in quite a while. And I was so captivated by the song, and I knew it was a Dylan tune, but I never really thought about what the words were until I heard Jerry sing it that night. So I actually went online for the first time to try to look up what the words were to Visions, because there were certain lines in that song that I just couldn't put together. So that was what got me on a computer and actually trying to find information.
That's what I had to do the first, because in at the Greek in '85 they played a double encore. One of them was "She Belongs to Me," which I had never heard before, and then "Visions of Johanna." And the best version of "Visions of Johanna" is on the album From the Fill Zone. It's a beautiful, beautiful version of "Visions of Johanna" if you're looking for one to listen to. For my birthday one year, I asked my wife to buy me a book of the Bob Dylan lyrics so I could get all the lyrics to his songs, because they were playing all these Dylan songs and I wanted to be able to find out what all the lyrics were, but there was nowhere else to go. That was the only way you could do it. This was all pre any of this stuff. So it's, I mean, can you imagine seriously what it would have been like for the Grateful Dead to come of age during the acid tests with, social media involved? It would be crazy.
Can you imagine that if social media was involved? I don't think the acid test could have ever happened. So which one drives the other? I mean, the fact that certain things could only happen privately. I mean, whether it was that scene or there's like the rave scene of the late '80s or other things that were underground. If there was social media, they would have been so overrun because the mass dissemination of information to the masses just wouldn't have allowed for something so special like that to happen in these small, like curated rooms.
I think that was social media, right? The acid tests were social media. That's what it was. That and everybody just got together, kind of, and boom, that's what we had. And it's great stuff. I really, I mean, that's a particular time and era. When I talk with my cousins and younger friends, and not some older friends too, with on the Fish Grateful Dead comparison, the Grateful Dead just captured so much of what was going on in America at that particular time, and they were so much at the forefront of helping, kind of shape a particular message and a particular way of life that resonated for so many people, in so many ways. And, the fact that they played great music certainly helped. And yeah, by the 1980s, people were going to see their music, but certainly part of what gave it resonance was who they had been and what they stood for, and where they for God's sakes, they got busted for marijuana. I mean, they were part of the team. I can say this, I feel like, I missed all of that. That predated me. And, as old as I think I am now, at least I know I'm young enough that I wasn't around, at least not consciously into all of it as much at that time to really appreciate, the role that they were playing in helping shape the direction that things were going. But, they used to play concerts in St. Louis at the Fox Theater, and, they were told we're going to turn off the power, and they'd say, come turn it off. We're here playing, and, or the famous stories of Bill Graham locking all the doors and saying, okay, now you're in a private party, and, they just play all night.
Well, Big Steve tells a story how they would put their own lock on the lockbox so the cops couldn't shut them off at midnight.
Right. Yep.
And another quick comment from me, I've heard it said that Grateful Dead tape trading was really the beginning of social media.
Well, that too, sure.
Yeah, I was thinking of social media back at that time as being, Mouse, Kelly, and Griffin posters put up all over the neighborhood to let you know where the show is going to be that night. But I think now we've seen where social media has gone, and there are mediums, obviously, the rise of Instagram and of Facebook and of Twitter, of being just, mass dissemination of information. But that's what makes Clubhouse so unique. It's the first time really where audio is the way to interact rather than, through text or through pictures. So to have, conversations where people are able to get involved in the conversation and take a subject matter that interests people and say, hey, we're going to, be moderators in a room. The way you can treat it is, I kind of like to break it down to 3 silos. You can either do like a TED Talk where you're just one person on stage as a moderator that's speaking to an audience that's interested in what you have to say. They can do it as a talk show where multiple moderators are speaking to one another to an audience. The way that Elon Musk was speaking to the CEO of Robinhood the other night for a couple hours, where almost 100,000 people tuned into that. And then you can do it where it's much more of a free-flowing exchange of ideas on a subject. So even as we're taping this right now, I was just checking my Clubhouse feed. There's 4 or 5 rooms right now about cannabis, whether it's cannabis branding, whether it's cannabis cultivation, whether it's cannabis regulatory and legislation. Whatever the subject matter is, there's people on there that have a lot to say, and they're able to share it with others. So as people are curious about a subject, they can go on there and find a home and find a place where they're getting really good information brought to them by people that have the expertise. So that side of it, I don't think we've ever seen that in social media before. And I think that's a medium that's about to really take off to allow different people with like-minded interests to get together without having to know one another until they get to know each other on this format.
I think you're right. And look, it's just an exciting time all the way around. It's a great new way to do it. And, and any way we can spread the good word on the friendly herb is good with me. One other thing that there's a lovely rumor going around. It's not a rumor because I've seen it with my own eyes. But again, my inability to properly make my way through the world of social media. I have seen pictures provided by my good friend Andy Greenberg of Society Jane fame out in the San Francisco Bay Area, and her partner Sharon Krinsky, who have really made a name for themselves out there, were able to send me photos of the new Grateful Dead branded edibles, chocolate bars and candy bars. And, typically, as you would expect for the Grateful Dead, not just your standard, chocolate and vanilla. They've got a little bit of everything in there. With beautiful artwork that's really, really incredible, and also exactly what you would expect to see. And what I was told is that there's some flower that will be coming soon. The chocolate bars are a collaboration between the Dead and Vosges Chocolate, Vosges. Not familiar with who they are, but if the Dead are associating with them, I assume that they must be they must be okay. So this was just a matter of time before the Dead dip their toe into this market. By the next show, we'll hopefully have some more information to share with everybody. But I guess, Rob, this really isn't entirely surprising, except maybe only just with respect to how close in proximity it is to the recent release of the Garcia line.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've known that the management's been sniffing around the space for quite a while. The band's certainly been looking at it. There's that period where, we were wondering whether the band would actually dive in collectively when Mickey went out with his own pre-rolls. But at this point, I have yet to see the product, but it does not surprise me at all that they finally hit a point where they've, chosen a channel partner and said, let's go out there and let's start releasing products. And I think it makes a great deal of sense. I mean, kind of the way, a Deadhead Cannabis Hour makes sense as a broadcasting medium. I think a Grateful Dead cannabis brand makes sense as something that's going to appeal to a great, huge mass of people. So it's only a question of time before it happened.
Yeah, I think so. And, really, of all the various branded strains out there, and some of them are, I guess, kind of, interesting and legendary. Jay-Z's got a brand, Carlos has a brand, Willie Nelson with his brand. But, there's something about Jerry and the Dead having a brand that really, that's what we were saying before. It's kind of like a peanut butter and jelly thing, right? It's just a natural fit. And, seriously, if you're a Deadhead, where else are you going to turn to? Who else are you going to trust in that department except, hey, the Grateful Dead, and here it is. And so that is a lot of fun. And, we don't see it here in the Midwest, and typically don't see it here for a while. So with COVID, it's not likely that I'll get out to California anytime soon necessarily. So I'll have to hear from my friends out there and wait for an opportunity to be able to get involved.
Yeah, I'd be happy to pick some up for you and send it your way. But of course, Larry, that would be illegal. So we can't be doing anything like that.
We would never, ever do that.
Never.
I will certainly listen to your review of it once you get your hands on it out there on the West Coast.
Well, perhaps I'll talk about it on my Ask Me Anything About Cannabis show on Clubhouse, which I'm doing now on Sunday nights. So for anyone out there that's listening, we'll find different topics to talk about all the time. So I'm not just a one-trick pony with the Grateful Dead. So definitely tune in. It's a pretty cool group. And Larry, obviously, you're going to be coming on, and Jim will be coming on, and Dan, our producer, will certainly be coming on as well to talk about all things cannabis, depending on the subject matter. We just try to curate it with different experts on that subject matter and try to make sure they can come on and an audience knows that they've got a place to ask questions safely.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. It's a lot of fun. Okay, well, Jim seems to have signed off, which is not unusual given that he was in transit. So on his behalf, I will say goodbye to all of our listeners. Rob, thank you again for another successful show. Great to have you on board.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for another great show, Larry. Thanks to Jim Marty, and thanks to Dan Humiston as our producer. But this is Rob Hunt from Linnea Holdings signing off, and thanks for another great week.
Okay, everyone. That's it for this week in the Deadhead Cannabis Show. Lots that we talked about, lots still to come that we're looking forward to. We hope you will continue to join us, that you will follow Rob and the rest of us on Clubhouse and other social media, and let us know what you think. In the meantime, take care of yourself, stay healthy, and enjoy your cannabis responsibly. Thanks, everyone.